Welcome to Echoes of Ihsan, and you know what that means, right?
Ah,
Another deep dive into some fascinating Islamic texts.
always exciting.
Yeah. And this time, we're going to be exploring the Muwatta Imam Malik, specifically Book 21, which focuses on jihad.
Ah, yes. A rich and often, I think, misunderstood topic, even in scholarship.
I think so too, and particularly in the modern context. So this book really offers a fascinating glimpse into how early Muslims, right back in those early centuries, viewed this really multifaceted concept, covering, as you said, a whole spectrum from spiritual striving to the actual practicalities of military conduct.
And I think what makes this book, The Muwatta, so fascinating is that it was compiled in the 8th century. And what that means is that it captures kind of a snapshot of Islamic thought during a period of significant change, right? You have
Right.
expansion, you have consolidation of the early Muslim community.
So we're not just talking about abstract theological principles, but really seeing how these concepts are being grappled with and applied.
In a real world setting,
Mhm.
absolutely.
In a very rapidly changing world. And that's what makes this book so valuable.
Yeah. And one of the themes that constantly emerges from this book is the concept of jihad. And as you mentioned, often misunderstood.
Right. And I think that's why we're doing this deep dive to unpack some of that.
Mm,
People tend to just associate it with violence and warfare, but as we'll see, the Muwatta presents a much more nuanced understanding.
absolutely. The word jihad, just in Arabic, literally means struggle, or you could say striving. And so in the Islamic context, it encompasses a wide range of efforts, both, internal and external.
So it's not just about, fighting enemies on a battlefield. It's also about kind of battling one's own inner demons, striving for self-improvement, and really, it's about that idea of upholding righteousness kind of in all aspects of life.
Exactly. And the Muwatta, I think, really illustrates this beautifully through, a collection of hadith, anecdotes, and legal rulings that help to shed light on how early Muslims actually understood and practiced this idea of jihad.
Okay, so let's dive into some of those stories and teachings. And right away, I think one of the things that we see is a hadith comparing someone engaged in jihad to a dedicated worshiper, someone who's tirelessly fasting and praying, never letting up. What's the significance of that comparison, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, think about it, fasting and prayer, those are acts of intense devotion.
You really have to commit to those.
Absolutely. So you're right, there's discipline, you need sacrifice, and a constant awareness of, I think, your relationship with Allah. And so this hadith, in a way, it elevates jihad to a similar level of spiritual exertion. And that's important, right?
So it's not just about, physical strength or courage on the battlefield. It's also about a deeper inner struggle.
I think you could say that. It's this constant striving to align, your actions, your intentions with the will of Allah.
It's almost like making your entire life a form of jihad.
Yeah, you could see it that way. And there's also a very powerful promise attached to this idea of striving, right?
There is. So tell me about that.
Okay, so the hadith goes on and it says that Allah guarantees one of two outcomes for anyone who engages in jihad with a sincere heart. They will either achieve martyrdom, which is seen as the highest honor, or they will return home safely, having, earned rewards and spoils of war.
And it's important, I think, for us to clarify for our listeners that this promise isn't just limited to physical warfare.
Yeah, it actually applies to all forms of striving in the way of Allah. So whether that's fighting against oppression, speaking out against injustice, or even, on a smaller scale, even just struggling to overcome your own bad habits.
So it really does encompass so much more than what we tend to think about.
Yeah. And so in that sense, right, every act of, righteousness, right, every effort we make to improve ourselves, to improve the world around us, I think that can be considered a form of jihad.
Okay, now, there's also this really interesting hadith that I think might seem a bit out of place to our listeners. It's about horses.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And the hadith talks about how horses, depending on the owner's intentions and how they're treated, can be a source of reward, a source of protection, or even a burden. So what do we make of that?
Yeah, so if you take your horse and you dedicate it to Allah's cause, you care for it, you use it for good, then even its grazing, even its footprints, they become good deeds for you, for the owner. But if you neglect the animal, if you mistreat it, then that actually becomes a source of sin.
So it's almost like this idea that even seemingly mundane actions can be imbued with spiritual significance. It all comes back to intention.
I think that's the point. Even something as simple as caring for an animal can be an act of worship if it's done with the right intention.
Wow, that's really beautiful. And then there's the story of Ubadah ibn as-Samit. He makes this pledge to the Prophet, and it seems to really encapsulate this essence of commitment. So
Yeah.
tell me, what is this pledge all about?
So Ubada, who was a companion of the Prophet, right, he pledges his allegiance. He says, I vow to listen and obey, whether it's pleasing or displeasing to me. And he also says, I will never dispute authority. And this pledge wasn't made lightly, right? This was a solemn commitment to follow the Prophet's teachings, even when it was difficult, even when it went against his own, personal desires or even societal norms.
Yeah, so much trust and submission. It's pretty amazing.
And I think, it highlights this idea that true faith isn't just about blind obedience. It's really about a deeper understanding, a commitment to the principles of Islam, even when they challenge us.
And that commitment extended beyond matters of personal faith as well, right?
Yeah.
Because it shaped their approach to warfare and military conduct, which I think might surprise some of our listeners.
It probably would, but the Muwatta actually dedicates a lot of time to outlining the rules of engagement, and there's a real emphasis on ethical boundaries, just and compassionate treatment of all people, even enemies.
So, knowing that spiritual weight of jihad, let's talk about some of the specific guidelines that they established, which even today would be considered progressive.
Right. For example, right off the bat, there's this prohibition against traveling with the Quran in enemy territory.
And Malik, he explains this is to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands, which makes a lot of sense to me. But what do you see in this?
Well, for me, it shows, this awareness, this understanding that even sacred objects can become tools of propaganda or justifications for violence.
So there's a real sense of, like, foresight there.
Absolutely. And I think that might surprise some people. They weren't just blindly following religious edicts.
And then there's this clear prohibition against harming women, children, and the elderly during military expeditions. And, I mean, this is a principle that's emphasized really throughout Islamic teachings to this day.
Exactly. It's a boundary.
An ethical boundary.
Absolutely. And the Muwatta has this story, it's about this warrior, and he hesitated to kill Ibn Abi Huquayk's wife during a battle. And he's torn, right? He's torn between his duty as a soldier and the Prophet's command not to harm women. So he's really caught in the middle, and it gives us, this glimpse into the internal struggles that people faced even back then.
Yeah, so these weren't just mindless soldiers going out into battle. They were really grappling with these moral dilemmas.
Exactly. And then you have this really detailed advice that Abu Bakr, the first caliph, gives to Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan right before sending him off to war.
He basically gives him like a whole rule book.
He does. Respect for life, property, the environment, even in enemy territory.
Which I think is something we don't often think about. The environment.
Right. He tells him not to burn beehives, not to scatter bees. It might seem like a small detail, but you're right. It shows this incredible respect for all forms of life.
And I think those instructions are just as relevant today as they were back then.
I agree. Especially, with all the debates that we have about the ethics of war and the environmental impact of conflict.
So we've got this balance, right? This kind of striving for peace. But then, when war does happen, there's this real sense of justice and fairness, even when it comes to dealing with, say, the spoils of war.
Yes, the Muwatta is actually very specific about that, talking about the sanctity of promises, even promises made during war, the proper handling of belongings. It's like they were trying to create the system of trust and accountability even amidst chaos.
Yeah. Like, okay, war is happening, but there are still rules. And this story of Umar ibn al-Khattab, he has this, like, furious reaction when a soldier betrays safe conduct granted to an enemy. What do you see in that story?
For me, it highlights how seriously they took promises. Even those made to enemies, they were not to be broken.
And it wasn't just verbal agreements, right? They also discussed those made by gestures. So like a hand signal or a nod of the head. And Malik says even those are binding, right?
Yeah. Which is really interesting. And for me, what it shows is that it's not just about the words themselves.
The intent behind them.
Exactly. And there are also rules regarding the handling of captured belongings. And for example, if something belongs to a Muslim, it has to be returned to its owner before any of the spoils are divided up amongst the warriors.
So again, this sense of fairness, even in a situation where it would be easy to overlook those things.
Right. They didn't want anyone taking advantage of the situation. And then you have the whole issue of ransoming or buying slaves in enemy territory, navigating the rights of the original masters. That must have been really tricky.
It was. And Muwatta actually talks about different scenarios, and it highlights the importance of, following Islamic principles. But at the same time, there's this consideration for the practical realities of the situation.
So there's some real nuance there. Like, how do you actually apply these principles in a complex situation?
Exactly. And it really challenges us to think more deeply about how we approach these issues today. Yeah, because we tend to want things to be so black and white. But often, they're not.
No, they're not. And that's what I think the Muwatta really offers. It's this nuanced approach. And it encourages us to, grapple with these tough questions.
So I think, that's a really good place for us to stop for today. But we're going to continue this deep dive in our next part.
I'm looking forward to it.
And we're going to explore some more of these, I think, really challenging concepts, particularly about the idea of martyrdom and its significance in the context of jihad.
Yes, a crucial part of this whole discussion.
So join us next time as we continue exploring the Muwatta Imam Malik.
Welcome back to our deep dive into jihad as described in the Muwatta Imam Malik.
It's incredible how this book really weaves together, the practicalities of life as an early Muslim with these deeper spiritual questions.
Absolutely. And today we're going to be delving into a topic that I think really embodies both of those aspects, martyrdom.
Yeah. And in the last part, we were talking about how jihad isn't just about warfare.
Right.
It's about this striving for righteousness in every aspect of life.
And in that context, martyrdom is seen as, the ultimate act of sacrifice, of devotion, giving your life for a just cause.
It's interesting because I think a lot of people today might view dying in battle as, a tragedy. But for early Muslims, at least as it's depicted in the Muwatta, it seemed to hold a much different significance.
Right. It wasn't just about dying. It was about the intention, the cause behind that death. Martyrdom, was this path to the highest spiritual station, you could say, a direct passage to paradise.
Yeah, and you can really feel that sentiment in the Hadith where the Prophet expresses his longing to fight and die repeatedly for the sake of Allah.
That hadith is powerful, It shows us the depth of his conviction, his love for Allah. He doesn't fear death. He embraces it.
It's a completely different perspective, isn't it?
It really is.
It makes you think about what you would be willing to sacrifice for your beliefs.
I think that's the point. And there's this other hadith, the one about Allah welcoming both the slain and the slayer into paradise, if their intentions were pure.
That's an interesting one. So even if two people fight and kill each other, their ultimate fate is determined by their intentions.
That's what this hadith is suggesting. Their commitment to fighting for what they believed in, for a just cause in the name of Allah, ultimately earns them paradise.
Wow. So, it's a very powerful concept, but it's important to clarify that this is referring to a specific context, right?
Yes, absolutely. This is about those fighting for a just cause. It's not just a blanket justification.
And that's why, the Muwatta is so detailed in its guidelines for warfare.
Absolutely. And the concept of martyrdom is always intertwined with these ethical guidelines. So even in the face of death, righteousness matters.
And the imagery associated with martyrdom in the Muwatta is quite vivid, especially that hadith about the martyr's wounds.
Oh yes, the one where the blood is the color of blood, but the scent is that of musk.
Right, on the day of judgment.
I mean, it's striking, isn't it? You have the brutality of battle and then this beauty and purity of paradise.
And I think it speaks to this idea that death in the path of Allah isn't a defeat. It's a victory.
A triumph, really, of the spirit over the flesh.
Exactly. But even with this reverence for martyrdom, the Muwatta doesn't shy away from the complexities, and we see this in Umar's prayer, where he asks not to be killed by someone who's even prayed a single prostration.
That's powerful. Here you have Umar, known for his strength, his piety, and he's expressing this inner turmoil.
Because even in a just war, there's this recognition of, the shared faith, the humanity of those who you might be fighting against.
Yes, and I think that's something that's often lost, in how we think about conflict.
Right. So we've been talking about this idea of striving for excellence, but the Muwatta doesn't just focus on this earthly life, right?
No, it also offers glimpses into the afterlife, what awaits those who live righteously.
And I'm thinking about that hadith with the gates of paradise.
Oh, each corresponding to a different virtue.
Yeah. A gate for prayer, a gate for those steadfast in jihad, a gate for those generous in charity. It's quite beautiful.
It is, and it speaks to this idea that there are so many paths to paradise,
Yeah.
so many ways to attain it.
Yeah. So, we should be cultivating all of these virtues.
Absolutely. And our actions in this life, they matter, not just for now, but for eternity.
And before we move on, I wanted to touch on one more story.
Hmm.
The one about the two martyrs from Uhud.
Whose bodies were found perfectly preserved.
Yeah, 46 years after their deaths.
It's remarkable. Imagine, discovering their bodies untouched by time.
Like a physical manifestation of that eternal life.
And I think it inspires us to live lives worthy of remembrance, lives that make a difference.
Right. And that leave behind a legacy of goodness. So stay with us. We're going to continue exploring jihad in the Muwatta.
So welcome back to our deep dive into the Muwatta Imam Malik. And over the last two parts, we've really been, exploring this concept of jihad and how multi-layered it is.
It's been a fascinating journey, really. Yeah, and from the idea of striving for inner righteousness to really those practical guidelines for warfare, I think what we see in the Muwatta is a faith that's really deeply engaged with the world, but also firmly rooted in those ethical principles.
And one thing that stood out to me, especially as we're talking about jihad, is how the Muwatta really challenges those, I guess you could say, simplified or reductionist views of jihad that are so common today.
You're right. It's so easy to just see that word and think violence, extremism. But like we've been saying, the Muwatta gives us this much, much richer understanding.
It does. And it's important, I think, to remember the historical context here. 7th century Arabia, a time of tribal conflict, societal transformation. And for those early Muslims, they were navigating a lot. Persecution, establishing a new community, defending themselves from outside threats.
So, jihad, as they understood it, as they practiced it, it encompassed both of those things. This physical struggle for survival, but also this spiritual struggle for righteousness.
Yeah. And even in the midst of all of that, what's amazing is this emphasis on ethics, on compassion, this deep, deep reverence for life.
Yeah, it really brings home that point, that Islam is, at its core, a religion of peace, of justice, of mercy, and that even when there's conflict, there are those clear boundaries, those guidelines to minimize violence and to make sure that actions are guided by ethical principles.
And those principles, are so relevant today.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, especially in a world where we see so much conflict that just feels intractable.
Right, where violence it's often the first resort.
Right. And so the Muwatta's teachings, I think, give us this timeless framework, really, for navigating those challenges with integrity, with compassion.
They really do.
So, how do we then reconcile this nuanced understanding of jihad with what we see happening in some parts of the world today? With the violence, with the extremism. How do we bridge that gap between these ideals that we see in the Muwatta and these distorted interpretations that fuel conflict and hatred?
That's such a good question, and it's a question that requires, I think, real honesty, real open dialogue. And, part of it is recognizing that historical texts that can be interpreted in different ways, and those interpretations, they can be influenced by so many things.
Politics, social context, even just personal biases. I mean, we've seen it throughout history.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Where religious texts have been used, manipulated, distorted to serve certain ideologies, to justify violence.
Right. And those actions end up being, completely opposite of the principles that are being espoused.
And it's a tragedy. And it's something, that we have to actively combat. Because the true spirit of jihad, as the Muwatta shows us, it lies in that striving for righteousness, upholding justice, promoting compassion, and not just in certain areas of life, but in all of it.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, we forget about that inner jihad,
Right.
that struggle against our own, demons, our own shortcomings.
Yeah, it's about conquering those and standing up for what's right, working towards a better world, a more just world.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to keep in mind that the vast majority of Muslims around the world, they condemn this violence, they condemn the extremism.
They recognize it has no place in Islam.
And we have to challenge these narratives that just paint Islam as inherently violent.
Right. As incompatible with peace. We have to amplify the voices of the scholars, the activists, even everyday Muslims who are working so hard to promote understanding, to build bridges.
To create that more peaceful and just world that we keep talking about.
No, we have to. And I think part of it is having these open and honest conversations, really engaging with these teachings and realizing that, like any religious tradition, there's going to be a range of interpretations, a range of practices.
So let's not just focus on, the actions of a few.
Exactly. Let's look at all those amazing examples throughout history of Muslims who have embodied the true spirit of jihad.
Yeah. And I'm thinking of people like, Muhammad Yunus, who did such incredible work with microfinance, won the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah. What about, Malala Yousafzai, risking her life for girls' education, continuing to inspire people all around the world.
Exactly. And there are countless others. And they're the true inheritors, of
Hmm.
this legacy of jihad. They're the ones showing us that striving for righteousness can take so many forms.
It can, and each one of those forms contributes to making humanity better. And that's the point.
And those are the people who embody that compassion, the service, the justice.
The things that are at the heart of Islam. And, they're reminders to all of us that the path to a better world, a more peaceful world, it lies in understanding, in
Mhm.
cooperation, in a shared commitment to the well-being of everyone.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I have to say, I'm left with this sense of awe, but also a lot of inspiration. Awe at the depth of these teachings and inspiration from those examples that we were just talking about. People who have really lived out these teachings and made such a difference in the world.
It's been an incredible journey. And I think we've really gone deep into a concept that's so often misunderstood, misrepresented. And I hope that we've come out of it with a deeper appreciation for what it truly means.
I hope our listeners have too.
Yeah.
And that you'll continue to explore, you'll keep having these conversations.
And that you'll strive for righteousness in all that you do.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Muwatta Imam Malik.